the information around the answer, you need to show that you also know that. So assume nothing and make sure that you put the knowledge into your exam answers when you complete them. And you'll also know that when you're asked for a definition, or you're asked for a piece of information in an objective response type of question, it's calling to basic knowledge. Do you know X? Do you know the formula for ROCE, for example? Do you know what liquidity is, for example? These kinds of things are basic knowledge. The next stage up, which is also dealt with in both the objective response and constructive response questions, is this whole idea of something called interpretation. This is the application of information. So you might be given a small scenario either in the objective response or constructive response papers. And here you're going to need to read that, understand that information, and pull different bits of your knowledge together in order to create the answer. So this is a higher skill, it's more difficult to do, but still we would be testing that within both the objective and constructive response papers. Now, we do recognise that the objective response has a limitation in terms of being able to explain thinking, and therefore we provide the CR responses to help you explore and explain and demonstrate your skills in being able to understand the impact of certain decisions or certain scenarios, and then being able to judge the best option. So you'll see here in the red area here, we're asking you to start to think about considering what happens if you do something, or if you make a particular decision, or make a particular recommendation. What's going to happen? What are the downstream consequences that you might need to consider or highlight as part of your answer? So thinking about the impact is really important in your CR exams, and I've got some strategies to help you make sure that you always do to hit those impact marks later. And finally, but by no means least, it's the judgment. So you'll be asked in a number of different questions in the CR type of question bank around what would be the best option, or what would be your suggestion or recommendation for a particular scenario. And at this, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've weighed up and considered options, a number of options, and at least two, to be able to make a selection and then evaluate the impact of that particular option, and being able to judge a range of different issues and place them in some kind of priority order. And so I hope that this slide kind of demonstrates that actually there are a range of skills that you need to be thinking about when you're actually writing your answers and when you're doing your revision, so that you're joining the dots and practicing the skills that we need to see you show in the exams. So Angèle was very kind in her introduction to explain that CIPS is on a journey to undertake a review of our assessments. So the assessments will remain very similar in terms of questions that you have been working on over the last year and a half. So I don't want to, I want to make it really clear. We're talking about the form of assessment, i.e. how is the assessment delivered to you, as opposed to changes in questions. So everything I've told you so far absolutely stands, but what we want to make sure is that the how we do the assessments works really well with learners, and we take on feedback from learners so that we make our assessments as focused on you and supporting your progression as possible. And in order for us to do this, then we need to make sure that we've got some really clear objectives for the review. So we need to make sure that the quality and the standards of the profession are maintained throughout, and that we support your progression. It's absolutely core and fundamental. We need to make sure that your learning journey is supported. We operate in a global community. I'm delighted to work for CIPS with our huge global reach, and therefore whatever assessment methodology we offer our students, it needs to work here in the UK, and it needs to work in Australia, it needs to work in the US, it needs to work in South Africa. So we need to make sure that whatever we offer is fair and the same to every one of our students. Also, it needs to be cost effective. We don't want our assessments to be very expensive. We want as many students to access the assessments as we can. So we need to make sure that it's cost effective. And we need to really think about these ideas of flexibility and seeing the extent to which we can offer flexibility within the way that we offer exams to our learners. And as I've said, it's learner-centric. And we also want to make sure that our assessments are as accessible for our learners as is feasible. And we recognise that that's something that we need to work on and develop. We also need to recognise that you have study centres that you are supported by, and that our study centres can also use and support you in your assessments as well. So we could draw a stakeholder map if we wanted to, in terms of all of the stakeholders involved in this assessment review. But let me make it really clear another time. The questions and the way that you're going to be asked your exams isn't going to change. It's just the methodology that we're going to be delivering it to you in is most important. So the scope is as follows. So firstly, let's think about exam scheduling. So we want to think about and look at the feasibility of something called on-demand objective response exams. So if I can point you in the direction of perhaps thinking about the exam you might sit if you're going to sit your driving test theory paper, where you book an exam with Pearson VUE, you pick the date, you do the revision for your exam, you turn up, and you're in full control as to when you want to sit your exam. And we're looking at a feasibility study of whether or not for our objective response exams something similar can be offered. There is the removal of the paper-based exams, so we're looking at a methodology by which we can remove paper, because that then makes the exam environment completely fair and across the globe. That doesn't impact colleagues in the UK, but it does impact some of our global colleagues. Just for completeness, the questions asked on the paper-based exams are exactly the same questions, or from the same question bank, as those that you might receive in a computer-based format. But you can imagine that actually making sure that it is, we're taking paper away, it will make it much more environmentally friendly and much speedier for CIPS and our learners as well. And then in terms of exam format, we are considering looking at the format of the CR exams in terms of, we know that we like the skills that the constructed response exams gives us. We want students to be using the higher order skills of looking at judgment, considering impact, etc. But we are considering different formats of that exam and how that might work, and a consultation is underway to do that, and I'll tell you about that just now. If my slide deck decides to work. Oh, there we go. Hopefully it'll work now. Right, so the assessments, just for now, we'll just kind of clear this up. So our paper-based exam centres represent 8% of all of the exams sat. And if you were to sit at a paper-based exam centre, you would have to pay the fee to CIPS for the exam, and you'd also need to pay a fee to the exam centre where that was held. There are CIPS study centre exam venues, and these are computer-based exam centres, and they represent about 72% of our proposition, and the costs there would be the exam fee to CIPS, and then there is a centre fee. And the CBE, remote invigilation, as we said earlier, that's growing to the 20% of all of our exams. And there is just the one fee there, and that's the cost of the entrance fee of the of accessing the remote invigilation exam thing. Now, Angela did ask me to mention something really important, so I'm just going to slightly tangent on this particular slide. So when we do remote invigilation, when a learner might select to do remote invigilation exams, CIPS and study centres work really hard with students to provide them with support materials so that they're ready for their exams and they're fully prepared. It's really important for learners to read the instructions more than once. Probably about a week before you set your exam, you need to read all of the instructions cover to cover, and at that point ask any questions. What is super stressful for learners is to look at the instructions maybe just as the exam is starting, or perhaps a few minutes before. That makes the exam experience for learners really, really difficult. So if you are going to be doing your first remote invigilation exam next week, put it down as an action, perhaps at the end of today's meeting, to take time to read through all of the instructions that you've been sent over, and then raise any questions in good time, so that you're fully ready and not stressed at all for your exam. So this is exams as they stand now, and there is a firm green line round the edge here, and the reason for this is that we would give you an exam schedule, and that exam schedule is what is on offer. So you'll know that the exams are, the next exam series beyond July next week is November, and you just have to work with that schedule at the moment. And that's the way things are at the moment, but there is things to come. So let me talk about the consultation that we're going through now. So this consultation includes lots of different stakeholders, and it might be that your study centres will be chatting to you around what's important for you in terms of your assessments, and what works well for you and what is more difficult. So we are undertaking a stakeholder survey as point number 1 here, and my study centre colleagues have been very generous with their feedback in terms of that. And we're analysing those results, and we will be undertaking focus group meetings with study centres from all over the world to understand what their requirements are, where their challenges are, so that we can actually then consolidate those requirements and then do something that's really important, which is play back those requirements to all of the study centres across the world to make sure that we've understood what the study centres have told us is important. And then we will be undertaking a market analysis to make sure that we identify suppliers and partners who are experts in the assessment methodologies. We'll be working with them to provide the requirements that our stakeholders are telling us are important to them. So this is a very detailed process, because CIPS is really committed to making sure that assessments work for everybody, and that they are globally fair as per the objectives that I discussed earlier. So that's the process that we're going through, and now we're going to go through a little workflow map. So we are here, it's now July, so we started the kind of roadmap for the this assessment review in June this year, and Angèle and her colleagues have been very generous in supporting us with this. So we are gathering requirements at the moment. This is for the on-demand exams. We're looking at instant results, and whether or not in the same way as I described your driving test theory, we can offer results immediately, and how important that is. Forms of the CR exam and the end of paper-based exams, as we discussed. So once we've gathered those requirements and played that back to our stakeholders, then we will undertake some market testing, and as procurement colleagues, you'll know how important that is to make sure that we test the market based on the requirements that we've identified, and then we will undertake an options review and a selection process. And once we've done that, we will then build into the requirements and then undertake a deployment. Now, you might be suggesting that this is quite a long period of time, and indeed it is. But forms of assessment need to be fair, and they need to be tested, and they need to work for everybody. And we want to make sure that those key tenets of assessments are absolutely adhered to throughout this process. And it's not to say for one moment that the assessments as they stand today aren't fit for purpose, because they absolutely are. What we're trying to do is develop more and to create the flexibility that we know has been important to our learners. And there's some really cool things around, and we want to explore and see how many of those are possible for CIPS. So the future is that we have this dotted line as opposed to a green firm line, and that dotted line is really to denote the fact that we are aiming for flexibility. We're aiming to make the assessment arrangements for our learners an assessment process that works for the learners, that is flexible and could be organised in such a way that you might do learning in a block for a 2 or 3 week period, and when you've completed your learning and revision, you then sit your CR exam and then quickly move on to the next CR exam. And it might be that we can develop a methodology whereby you can actually do your assessments in blocks, but in shorter periods of time, or indeed over longer periods of time as it suits you, but it's much more about giving learners that flexibility. Okay, so I'm going to pause there to see whether or not there's any questions at this point before I move on to the next bit. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen to see if there's anybody who would like to ask a question at this point.
Hi Fiona, there's actually one question in the Q&A box, and
Lovely.
basically I haven't got a name for that, so it came through as anonymous. However, the question is basically, presuming that the OR exams are marked automatically, why is there a delay in results being given to the students? Would this be removed if OR exams were on demand?
Okay, that is a really, really good question, because you would think, well, if it's marked by a computer, then why do we not get automatic results at the moment? Well, the current process at the moment, and this goes for all CIPS exams, is that there is a quality review process for every single exam that is sat to ensure that those the answers are of the high quality that you would expect of CIPS. Makes it fair for everybody. If we were to deploy an on-demand results type of methodology, then clearly the quality assurance piece needs to be done almost at the same time as the marking's going on, as opposed to something that is happening after the assessment's been undertaken. So yes, that would be one of the requirements that would need to be worked into any kind of solution that we would need at that point, because we don't want to compromise the standards at that point. But yeah, it's a really good question to ask. Thank you. Oh, another anonymous attendee. Shall I read this out?
Yes, go on, Fiona.
Okay, righty, lovely, thank you. So on reviewing the plan for November 21 L4 CR exams, I can only see that there will be one sitting of L4 M8. Okay, so this is for the November exams. So yeah, there is one sitting of L4 M8 in November, and it might not be, you might not view it as flexible, and that's why we're kind of undertaking this review, to make sure that there is more flexibility. I do urge you to, if that's the exam you want to sit, I do urge you to book it to make sure that you can complete that exam in a format that works for you. So whether it's going to a study centre or whether it's going via remote invigilation. There is flexibility in terms of where you sit in November. There isn't so much flexibility, as you say, in terms of the actual scheduling, and that is something that we want to want to work on. John, thank you for your question in terms of discounts and on exams. John, there are no discounts on any exam fees. They are published, and under Ofqual regulations, we can't offer discounts on any of those things. It's part of the way that we're required to operate. But that's a good procurement question. Thank you for that. Any other questions on assessments and before we move on?
It seems that Angel's hand is raised, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. That's correct. Before we move on to part 2 of the presentation, I wanted to say thank you so very much to Fiona. It was a very clear and comprehensive presentation, and also for sharing the projects you are taking on for the next 12 months, 14 months or so. It's really good. So I would like to encourage now all the participants to ask questions. I'm sure they have it, whether it's about assessment or anything to do around what Fiona explained just now. Now is your chance. That was it.
A question from Justin. Why does CIPS not work assessments anymore to truly assess a procurement professional's capability? That's an interesting question, Justin. I think what you're are you thinking about work-based assessments? Hopefully, Justin, you'll come back and answer me that question. If yes, it is. Okay. It's a really good question, and I know that back in the midst of time, work-based assessments were undertaken. And you know what? That is going to, hopefully, that will form part of our review of the constructed response. Maybe there will be a place for work-based assessments within that piece of work. I think that there's real opportunities in that. The real challenge, though, Justin, I have to say, with my standards hat on, is trying to provide a standardized approach so that it is fair to everybody is one of the challenges that we need to kind of work through. But it is a fair question to ask, so thank you for that. Lloyd, hello there. Thank you for your question. How might the market testing approach work with new exam formats? Will this be part of a pilot group or rolled out more broadly? Lloyd, it's a really good question in terms of what do we find. So the first thing we need to do is work out what it is that our learners and what it is that our study centres need before we work out how we're going to deploy. So clearly we need to make sure that whatever we deploy is fair and is tested well. So the kind of project plan and the specifics around pilots and whatnot hasn't yet been worked through, but I can assure you that that will be worked through at the right time. And in terms of training and making sure that learners are fully engaged and trained on the particular technologies, I would just point you to the amazing uptake of remote invigilation exams this year. Learners were amazing, study centres have been terrific in a standing move from 0% to 20% of our exams done in that way. So it shows that our study centres, working in partnership with CIPS and learners, we can deploy and deliver quite rapidly, which makes me feel very confident for the plan going forward. But Lloyd, at this moment in time, we're at the very beginning of that process, and we will make sure that process is quality and of high standard throughout to give all learners assurance that it's going to be fair and works properly. Thank you for that. Another anonymous person: will all exams